Thank you, Kurt. I haven't been called great before, so I can tick that off. There are many Peter Halls that have been called Sir, and I'm not one of them. And thank you to the graduating students for inviting me back to this conference, and to Alice. I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate this milestone, and not least because I really think that design is a field desperately in need of some good criticism. Earlier this year, I visited the Red Dot Design Museum in Germany, housed in a former boiler house at a colliery in Essen. Converted by Foster & Associates in '96, this 43,000 square foot museum retains much of the atmosphere of the boiler house, with giant pressure gauges hanging from the ceilings, furnaces cut open, and catwalks used for the display of about 1,000 contemporary consumer goods, all winners of the Red Dot Design Awards. It's a strange juxtaposition. Despite implicitly and quite experimentally suggesting an industrial context for consumer products, it's not a museum that sheds light on the things on display. Rather, we are invited to fetishize both the objects and the backdrop, marveling at the prize-winning forms or the evocative ambience of the boiler house. No light is shed on how these Tupperware containers, cars, lights, desks, etc. came into existence, the battles between designer and marketing chief and engineer, between engineer and polypropylene, or even how object forms were negotiated amid historical and corporate precedents, unpredictable machines, weather, and the size of freight containers. Instead, the juxtaposition exacerbates the gap between what the French theorist Bruno Latour would call matters of fact, the finished perfect objects, and matters of concern, all the messy stuff that happens before and after this illusory moment of perfection. Yes, there's the gorgeous object, but there's also the point when the object breaks, is thrown away, the metal is salvaged, the nickel cadmium leaches into landfills, the rubber reappears as playground mulch. In this design museum, it's as if these objects fell from outer space. I asked the president of Red Dot why it is that design museums don't seem to ever show exhibitions of design failure. Because failure, it seems to me, is a way of revealing context, the battles and wrangling between the stakeholders that precedes the production of design, and the public reception that follows its release. This book, a favorite of mine I picked up for $1.99 in a half-price bookstore, a must-read for all design critics. It's full of juicy nuggets on design disasters, like the Ford Edsel of '57. It was $300 million on a land yacht, just as land yachts were going out of favor. Raymond Loewy's 1963 Studebaker Avanti on the top right. That one cracked in the heat. The British Bond bug down there, that was just plain ugly. And the amphibious German Amphicar, whose engine seized up when it took to the water. The Red Dot Design Museum's answer, the president's answer, was simple enough. He said, failure is a touchy subject among designers. To call something a failure is potentially to hurt a designer's feelings or even damage their reputation. But an exhibition of design failures would surely be fascinating, surely a crowd pleaser. You could have historic failures like Antonio Sant'Elia's utopian futurist city, on the left there, which died in the trenches with a bullet in the architect's head. Or Tatlin's monument to the Third International, which Leon Trotsky squished with an incisive critique in 1924. You could have successful failures like Philip Stark's Lemon Squeezer, proved functionally useless but semiotically priceless. Most of us have a few bona fide failures in our homes. Cans of OK soda, I have a couple, still undrunk. Ill-fated fruit drink launched by Coca-Cola in 2003. With an ad campaign and packaging aimed at getting disenfranchised hipsters to quote Thomas Frank, commodify their dissent. The drink, packaged with downbeat slogans and deadpan illustrations by Charles Burns and Dan Close, tested poorly and was abandoned after 7 months. And you could have a whole gallery of failed drinks. The new Coke flavor that bombed, Coors Spring Water, Crystal Pepsi, a kind of health soda, caffeine-free and colorless, which went the way of smokeless cigarettes. And of course, Tropicana's redesigned packaging by Arnell Group, which arguably failed because of popular opinion or mob rule, was galvanized like never before by social media. And failed consumer electronics, straight from the marketing textbooks. The Sony Betamax, better quality but limited to 1 hour per tape when its rival VHS could record entire movies. And the Apple Newton message pad, with its much ridiculed handwriting recognition, but arguably a stepping stone for the iPhone and a prototype for the iPad. But perhaps there's a little guilt driving my quest for failure here, because like the Red Dot Design Museum, as a reporter on design, I've disseminated in countless articles the essential subtext that new equals good. The system's quite simple. A company has a new product, its PR people contact the media, knowing that featuring new products attracts readers and advertisers, sends its journalists to report on the story of the new product. Even if the product vanishes within months, the traditional design media generally doesn't feature it because no one told them the company had folded and the chairs went to the shredder. Since design needs to promote itself anyway, why do we want to disseminate that story? Case in point is the glorious rise and sudden disappearance of Herman Miller Red, the office furniture system that was supposed to furnish all those new .coms sprouting at the beginning of the millennium. Did anyone follow up after the whole line was abandoned? I didn't. Of course, the newspapers and business press are interested in failure. There's no shortage of stories on failed businesses, non-profits, wars, economies. But when it comes to design and architecture criticism, we seem to be back to the new equals good phenomenon. As Alexandra Lang argued in her attack on the New York Times architecture critic Nikolai Rusov earlier this year, quote, architecture criticism cannot simply be about what's new, because that leads precisely to the globe-trotting, stargazing, architecture as sculpture approach we have now. Rusov is an easy target, but we're all guilty. We appraise things based on images rather than visiting or using them. We love the new, and we love our celebrities. So how do we get beyond this trap and propagate a discourse that acknowledges there's a difference between the images and the buildings or objects that people actually use? The key, I think, is to stop viewing design things as sculptures and start viewing them as instantiations of larger issues. And this is what I mean by an irreductive criticism. Now, those of you that have iPhone dictionaries, don't look up irreductive now, because it doesn't yet appear in the dictionary. But I didn't make it up. Time for a philosophical interlude. The word comes from Bruno Latour's 1988 book on Louis Pasteur, where he asks the question of what would happen if, quote, nothing can be reduced to anything else, nothing can be deduced from anything else, everything may be allied to everything else. Essentially, that's the philosophy behind actor-network theory, that the world is not a manifestation of essential substances, a la Aristotle, or eternal ideas and laws, a la Plato, but is made up of actors or actants, human and non-human, which form alliances or networks. Here's the cheat's guide to actor-network theory, Graham Harman's book. Harman is a philosopher based at the American University in Cairo. He spells out Latour's object-oriented philosophy in this book. He says, atoms and molecules are actants, as are children, raindrops, bullet trains, politicians, and numerals, end quote. Every actant is an event, completely specific to a place and time. They are defined in terms of their relations or alliances. Now, that's not a multi-layered sandwich on the cover of the book, but a DVD box set by the Melbourne-based art group, A Constructed World. The DVDs, and I think this is, I'm guessing anyway, this is why they picked the image, have been assuaged into a kind of alliance with the help of some cling film, saran wrap, and public familiarity with the marketing concept of a box set. So the network is formed. Sometimes those alliances become so strong that they form what Latour calls black boxes. And here's where design comes in. A black box is a technology, object, concept, or scientific theory so firmly established that we tend to take its interior, its veracity, for granted. Here's a page from Latour's book, Science in Action. He has these quirky little diagrams throughout. The goal of every invention, design, or scientific theory is to become a black box, since once it is taken for granted, it will not be challenged at every turn. It becomes orthodoxy. We need black boxes to make sense of things. If we had to question Newtonian physics every time we poured a glass of water, we'd die of thirst. But for science to progress and for design discourse to evolve, black boxes need to be opened up, a daunting task undertaken by iconoclastic types. Latour calls them dissenters. We could add to that list, we could call a dissenter a renegade scientist, a designer, maybe even design critics. This is where failure is useful. Latour's first rule of method in the appendix of Science in Action can as easily be applied to objects of design study as to facts and machines in science. He says, we study science in action and not ready-made science or technology. We either arrive before the facts and machines are black boxed, or we follow the controversies that reopen them. So here's Latour's own intriguing model of such a reopening of a black box. The 1993 book, Aramis. Aramis was not only the name of one of the musketeers, it's a personal rapid transit system developed and prototyped in France between 64 and 87, when it was unceremoniously scrapped. Its failure is an essential part of its appeal. The case is not closed. Here it is in a Parisian workshop the year of its demise, not a black box, but a quasi-object, as Latour calls it, suspended between text and thing. The system aimed to blend the benefits of hub-to-hub mass transit with those of point-to-point private car transportation. A commuter would simply book an automated car in advance. It would arrive at his or her house, perhaps with a number of other commuters on board, and then connect with a train of cars traveling down along the boulevards before finally peeling off towards its final destination. There's no single reason why the project failed, and that's the point of actor network theory. No grand narratives to explain things away. No reductive summary. Just a close analysis of how the precarious network of alliances between actors, the engineers, the politicians, the pilot vehicle, which also has agency, fell apart. Interestingly, from a writing point of view, there's no single authority in the book either. Latour's story is told through a distributed narrator using 5 different typefaces for the different points of view, including the point of view of Aramis itself. So, looking for examples of what I might call irreductive criticism of failure, design failure, I came across Catherine Bristol's 2004 account of Pruitt-Igoe. This is the post-war St. Louis housing project demolished in 1972. The photograph and footage of that demolition became not only seen in Koyaanisqatsi, but the kind of poster child of what Charles Jenks called the end of modernism. This reductive pat account of its failure is entrenched in design discourse, that somehow this moment, this image, represents the failure of the whole modernist Corbusian dream that everyone could be housed in a rationalized city of machine-like structures with segregated leisure, work, and residential zones. In fact, as Bristol shows in this essay, there were many social and economic factors or actors at play in Pruitt-Igoe's demise, of which architectural design was probably the least important. There was the systemic failure to adequately support public housing in America, which meant impossible budgets and chronic cost-cutting had to be imposed by St. Louis Housing Authority. The architects were only really guilty of being relatively novice pushovers. They agreed to revise their original mixed-use, mixed-height plan for the high-density scheme, and then accommodated budgeting measures that eliminated amenities such as play areas, these got cut, landscaping, ground floor bathrooms, and value engineered the points of contact between the tenants and the living units, the result of which was that there were poor quality doorknobs and locks that broke, inadequate frames that allowed the wind to blow out the windows. Ended up looking like this. Falling occupancy was a significant factor as tenants found inexpensive private dwellings as alternatives to the isolated high-rises. St. Louis officials had failed when they planned the whole Pruitt-Igoe project to anticipate that their scheme was conceived when demand for low-income housing units in the inner city was at a record high due to dislocation caused by federal-sponsored slum clearance and the highway program. As occupancy rates fell at Pruitt-Igoe, vandalism and crime grew, and the housing authority had less rent to maintain the buildings. A 9-month rent strike by tenants in '69 effectively put the nail in the coffin. Bristol concludes that Pruitt-Igoe was simplified as an architectural failure to make architecture seem important. Another failure And another point about an irreductive analysis of a high-profile failure is that it refuses to stay within the traditional disciplinary boundaries of design discourse. The various investigations into the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, which killed all 7 crew members in 2003, find a huge network of suspects: the foam insulation that fell off the fuel tank during takeoff and left a hole in the shuttle's wing, damaging the thermal protection system, which caused the shuttle to burn up on re-entry. Low-resolution video footage was another actor. The footage of the takeoff made it difficult to assess the damage caused by the foam. NASA management's systemic failure to recognize the relevance of engineering concerns for safety, and its attitude that nothing could be done anyway once the thing was in orbit. NASA's decision-making and risk assessment processes, and bringing the failure right back into the heart of traditional design discourse, the graphic user interface of Microsoft's PowerPoint software. I'm sure you're all familiar with Edward Tufte's polemic, The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint, which finds that a set of PowerPoints drafted for NASA by engineers at Boeing during the shuttle's 2-week orbit after takeoff was shaped by deficiencies built into PowerPoint's user interface. Tufte contends that PowerPoint's hyper-rational hierarchy abbreviated and then deprioritized or deleted important data that would have indicated to NASA that Boeing's test data was irrelevant rather than reassuring, as NASA management officials assumed from the slides. 2 subsequent investigations after the disaster concurred that the endemic use of PowerPoint briefing slides instead of technical papers highlighted a problem with communication methods at NASA. Here's one of those slides from the PowerPoint briefing, and Tufte connects its deep hierarchical structures, PowerPoint's relentlessly sequential, nested, one short line at a time delivery with the same characteristics of Microsoft, a big bureaucracy engaged in computer programming, and PowerPoint's tendency to toward advocacy rather than analysis, toward style over substance, marketplace ethics. He attributes to Microsoft's marketing-driven culture. And you're all familiar with this week's cover of the New York Times, which made the same points that Tufte had made, quoted generals generally suspicious of PowerPoint's abbreviated quality. Though I have to point out here, the Times writer, I think, was a little misguided in imagining that this map could have been produced in PowerPoint. He tried to redeem himself by quoting the somewhat more insightful General McMaster, who said that PowerPoint's worst offense is not a chart like this spaghetti graphic, but rigid lists of bullet points that take no account of interconnected political, economic, and ethnic forces. This kind of user interface failure, I think, illustrates Alan Turing's point that computers are, after all, an outgrowth of bureaucracy. I think this is what David Strigley is getting at in his highly scientific diagram of data processing. It's also obvious when you look at visual strategies of Microsoft and Apple operating systems that the hierarchical file folders, Windows desktops, and Office wastebasket metaphors that we use every day all come out of office culture, out of bureaucracy. I think we begin to see that design failure is not confined to the kinds of high-profile disasters I've discussed this far. Failure is an inevitable part of design. Steve Heller's book was very much about this. Well, I should name which book, but we'll leave that for later. As much as designers like to talk about solving problems, the interesting design problems are rarely really solved. They're responded to, alleviated, deferred. Graphic user interfaces are always failures in the sense that they're failures to mimic or replace the complexity of human-to-human interaction. Human-computer interaction was a field that emerged, we have to remind ourselves, from the military-industrial models of artificial intelligence, which had a tendency to favor an encyclopedic approach to machine thinking. Common sense, it was imagined, could ultimately be catalogued as a system of rules. The anthropologist Lucy Suchman's work at Xerox PARC in the 80s is a particularly useful, irreductive critique of the prevailing models of artificial intelligence that informed human-computer interactions at the time. She was enlisted to study the problems people had operating a new feature-rich photocopier, and Suchman observed that the way machines are scripted to converse, quote unquote, with people seemed to be built on a completely different model from the ones that described how people talk to each other in sociological research. She noted that human conversation does not follow a message passing model as mathematical theories of communication posit. Rather, humans, she says, dynamically co-construct the mutual intelligibility of a conversation. So we arrive at meaning as we converse. And this is a complex and rich process, which I've reduced to two very simple examples. If A asks B, are you coming? And B replies, I gotta work, the negative is implicit, buried in the response. Computers have a hard time with that, as we know from everyday voicemail interactions. Similarly with the coffee counter exchange below, which I'm guessing isn't just a phenomenon of New York delis, too busy to bother with yes and no. People videotaped using the photocopier at Xerox performed a variety of activities in relation to the machine, observed Suchman, that didn't change its state. The machine itself appeared quite oblivious to their difficulties and could only perceive a small subset of their actions, such as doors being opened and closed, buttons being pushed, paper trays being filled and emptied. Suchman writes, it was as if the machine were tracking the user's actions through a very small keyhole and then mapping what it saw back onto a pre-specified template of possible interactions. I think that's the end of the philosophical interlude. You can wake up now. When you think about it, most designs are redesigns of something that either didn't work so well in the first place or failed to keep up with the changing world. Look at the design of navigation systems in airports or on highways, another kind of interface where the system fails people on a daily basis. The information the designer chooses to display and the manner in which it's displayed must be both able to anticipate the situatedness of each individual traveler, their ability to read maps, languages, correlate color to sign function, interpret symbols, and so on. Paul Meixenar, perhaps the world's best-known airport wayfinding designer, notes that you cannot individualize information on signs, so you have to make generic information, so there's always a gap, a large group, that doesn't fit. He says you have to provide additional layers of information for, say, elderly people, people with impairments, and people with different languages. Even pictograms, once thought to be the great answer to everything, are limited. A suitcase pictogram, for instance, can mean baggage reclaim or baggage check. Seems to me that the closer you look at design, the more you see failure. And in truth, I don't think it hurts designers to talk about failure. I'd like to talk about a personal failure as a lead up to my grand conclusion on why I think the time for a new class of design critics has never been riper. In the spring of 2001, just after George W. Bush's controversial election, I'd been editing SVA, the occasional print journal of the non-profit World Studio Foundation, which is an organization set up to redress the lack of minorities in the design professions by awarding diversity scholarships. Based on the news that Bush had only left the country once on official business, we decided to make it the Wish You Were Here postcard issue, inviting designers around the world to design a postcard for readers to mail to the White House, drawing Bush's attention, we hoped, to an issue they felt we needed him to look at. Rhonda Rubenstein did this one on the Alaskan Wildlife Refuge, which was threatened by the invasion of oil drilling devices. And David Byrne, the musician, did one on the Republican Party's apparent abuse of power in the 2000 elections. And Sean Wolfe designed a Wish You Weren't Here postcard featuring a cartoon bush with bleeding eyes that could be poked out on the reverse side with a sharp object to leave hanging chads. It was blunt, but we were angry, and somehow we thought that it would galvanize people. The art director of SVA, who is European, decided to put Wolfe's card on the cover as part of a redesign of the American flag. And because of various print production factors, the issue was delayed and delayed and delayed, and finally mailed the week before the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. You can imagine the reaction when this plopped on people's doormats. The morals of the story, with the benefit of hindsight, are that timing is everything, print is slow, and be careful with agitating at the level of loaded signifiers, as their meaning can suddenly blow up in your face. I think the problem was similar with adbusters and culture jamming, which tended to polarize rather than galvanize. As the great media scholar Judith Williamson told Jerry Began in ... magazine around that time, I think there's an overemphasis on the signifier. We're caught in its glare. Or to come back to Alexandra Lang's article, obsession with signifiers seems to be the problem with the stargazing architecture as sculpture approach we have now. Since SVA, I found myself becoming much more invested in non-traditional venues for discourse. 2 years ago, as part of Design Inquiry, which is this experiment to set up a kind of think tank alternative to the Designer Celebrities Show and Tell conference, I helped organize a week-long investigation on a remote island in Maine into design and failure, using fail again from Samuel Beckett's phrase, try again, fail better. That's from Know How On. That was our title. Our findings are published in an online journal with downloadable PDFs that fold into handy trifolds. Here's Anne MacDonald's visual essay on vernacular sign systems that present a kind of typographic failure that nevertheless serves to inform and inspire typographic orthodoxy. And here's my essay on neon typography, which after interviewing a few Austin-based tube benders and designers, I realized is a kind of twofold failure, a technical failure to mimic print with neon tubes, with all sorts of workarounds like painting the glass tubes black between letters to make the letters appear discrete and legible. And then the sort of bigger picture failure that the neon in the neon tube is a gas literally excited by electricity to glow. So it's a thing, an actor if you like, full of desire and used to feed desire. So neon is always promising something it fails to deliver. Unlike the giant LCD billboard or the floodlit building, neon comes with a highly visible flip side, a kind of sadness, the tangle of wires, blackened wires, in its daily dysfunctional state. Another scene, a Design Inquiry fail again. At this time, when publishing is amid a major upheaval, it seems that the liveliest place for a new critical discourse of design to propagate has to be non-traditional. The low-budget symposium, the blog, the podcast, or the online journal. These have the obvious benefit of being free of the lead times of print and free of the advertising-driven obligation to frame design solely in terms of the new and the novel. The new mediascape needs new critics because the old ones are still working from an antiquated premise. When newspapers, magazines, and TV were influence shapers, architecture and design critics were called upon as tastemakers to argue what was good and what was hot, conflating the two value judgments along the way. Because of its relative infancy, design criticism was a fresh, cheekier version of art history. Instead of writing about paintings, palaces, and sculptures, we wrote about ice cream trucks, coffee cup lids, and surfboards. But that's not enough in the age of consumerist burnout and environmental crisis. We don't need to justify design's importance to the world or to the art establishment. We need to look into how design works and where it's going wrong. We need a new generation not to venerate design, but to sniff out failure. The days of armchair criticism and sardonic semiotics are over. And with that, I'd like to leave you with one more philosophical interlude, or closing remark from Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose words I think still resonate. Don't look for the meaning, look for the use. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Early on in that talk, I finally remembered the Beckett quote that you hit upon late, and it seems to me passed over too quickly, because you've talked in that great talk about failure as the failure of end products that we need to be frank about and admit. But one of the things Beckett was saying is something in my highly sub-Beckettian way as a writer I experience every day, which is to say, I fail and fail and fail every day. as you're trying to put together sentences. And so it seems to me that isn't it important in design and in the design discourse to say and admit and look closely at the way failure is inherent to the process of design?
Yeah, it was hard to narrow down my focus with this talk, and knowing Steve's work with the book Design Disasters, and that sort of general discourse in engineering that failure is important because it progresses the field.
Yeah.
I decided that I really wanted to steer over to this idea of the black box, and that the failure is the way into opening up the black boxes. I totally agree. Failure is part of writing. It's part of craft, right? That's
exactly.
Yeah.
And once that is understood by as many people as possible, it seems to me it can begin to destigmatize the kinds of failures you're focusing on, so that, yeah, we can talk about that. We all, if we fail every day in the craft of doing something, then, big failures perhaps are less stigmatized. It also seems to me, I wonder if a corollary to that and to what you're talking about is if there isn't maybe an inverse relationship between failure along the way, that you fix, that you fail better, that you fail greater, that you redo, revise. The more you do that, maybe the less a chance of an ultimate end product failure.
Yeah, that would make sense, right?
Well, there you go. And my other question before I let you go is, do you think that the relative transparency, or at least translucency, of the online world, that people blog and tweet, and much of the discourse in all realms, not least design, is now provisional, sketchy, work in progress, a draft, and therefore the embedded failure more apparent in people's thinking? Is that a good thing?
Yeah, I think I was really trying not to sound like an old codger today, because, but now's my opportunity. That's a kind of failure that would seem progressive, but there's a downside to it, which is the absence of the editor. And I'm a great believer. I guess this comes back to your first point about craft. Like, you need an editor to improve your craft. And the absence of editors in online discourse is really alarming. And I guess that's why we need programs like this and people like you teaching in them.
Well, and we need to take the transcript and then spend days and weeks making ourselves sound more eloquent as we revise and extend our remarks, I think.
Yeah, and I was thinking about your comment, or Alice's comment, about writing for the ear being different from writing for text. I realized that when I was going through my talk. I'd invented a tongue twister, which looked fine in writing, but when I read it out, it was...
Well, you can come and take the class next fall.
I'd love to.
Peter Hall, thank you very much. And now on with the show.